Before we dive into today's shocking revelation, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more breaking celebrity news. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on all our latest content. The courtroom was already tense on day 12 of the Diddy trial. Legal teams arranged papers, reporters scribbled notes, and spectators whispered amongst themselves. But when Amelia Richardson's name was called, everything stopped. Security tightened. Phones were double-checked at the door. Even the judge seemed to sit up straighter. For 10 years, Amelia Richardson had been the invisible force behind Sean "Diddy" Combs's daily operations, his executive assistant, his gatekeeper, the person who managed his most private affairs. She'd never given interviews. She'd never spoken publicly about her former employer. She'd simply disappeared from the industry after leaving his employment in 2014, seemingly vanishing into ordinary life. Now, she walked steadily toward the witness stand, dressed in a simple navy suit, her expression unreadable. No dramatic entrance, no attention-seeking behavior, just quiet determination as she took her seat. Diddy, who had been maintaining a composed facade throughout most of the trial, visibly tensed. His attorney placed a cautioning hand on his arm. For perhaps the first time since proceedings began, Diddy looked genuinely alarmed. The prosecution had kept Richardson's testimony a tightly guarded secret. Her name had never appeared on any witness list, never been mentioned in any pretrial motions. Her appearance now was clearly a strategic bombshell. As Richardson was sworn in, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. She adjusted the microphone, slightly, her hands steady despite the pressure of dozens of eyes fixed upon her. "Ms. Richardson," the prosecutor began, "can you please state your former position and the years you worked for the defendant?" Her voice was clear and measured when she answered, "I was Sean Combs's executive personal assistant from 2004 to 2014. I managed his schedule, his household staff, his travel arrangements, and his personal matters." "And what did those personal matters include?" the prosecutor asked. Richardson looked directly at Diddy for the first time. Everything he needed to keep hidden. Before we continue, viewer discretion is strongly advised. The following information comes directly from federal court proceedings and contains disturbing details. This content is presented for educational purposes only. Nobody expected Amelia Richardson to testify. The room was completely still. Eyes focused on this new witness as she calmly arranged herself at the stand. No media leaks had prepared anyone. No rumors had circulated. Just this woman who had once been the shadow behind one of music's most powerful figures, now stepping into the light. Until that moment, the trial had featured celebrities, former business partners, and alleged victims. But something different radiated from Richardson. Maybe it was her professional demeanor, the way she answered questions with precise clarity. Maybe it was the detailed notebook she brought with her, a decade of meticulously documented events. Maybe it was the flash drive she handed to the court clerk, containing what she described as digital evidence spanning 10 years. Whatever it was, the atmosphere shifted from tabloid drama to something much more substantial. Richardson wasn't testifying as a scorned employee or vindictive former colleague. She was there as someone who had documented a decade of concerning patterns, who had saved emails, receipts, calendar entries, and photographs with the foresight of someone who knew they might one day be needed. And when she began speaking, her words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed everything from the inside. Because what Richardson revealed about the operation behind Diddy's public image, the systematic covering of tracks, and the elaborate mechanisms used to silence problems wasn't just shocking. It was presented with undeniable evidence. I need to clarify something from the start, Richardson began, her voice steady and professional. I'm not here for publicity or financial gain. I've been subpoenaed to testify, and I've chosen to cooperate fully rather than fight that subpoena, because I believe it's time for the truth to be known. The judge nodded, giving her permission to continue. The jury leaned forward, clearly recognizing the significance of this witness. Diddy's attorneys whispered urgently to each other, one of them frantically writing notes. My role with Mr. Combs evolved significantly over the years, Richardson continued. What began as typical executive assistant duties gradually expanded into managing what his team called special situations, which was our code for problems that needed to disappear. The prosecution approached with a document. Ms. Richardson, can you identify this? It was an employment contract addendum, dated 2006, with both Richardson's and Diddy's signatures. She nodded. This was presented to me after 2 years of employment, she explained. It includes unusual confidentiality provisions and significantly increased my salary. It was made clear that signing this was necessary if I wanted to continue in my position. It started like any other day of the trial. The room buzzed with low conversations. Reporters compared notes on yesterday's testimony. Attorneys reviewed documents. But when Amelia Richardson's name was called, the atmosphere transformed. You could hear papers rustling as journalists frantically searched their research for information on this new witness. There was nothing. Exactly as the prosecution had planned. The judge regarded this new development with professional interest. And Diddy, who had been projecting controlled confidence throughout the proceedings, suddenly looked like someone who'd seen a ghost. His attorney gripped his shoulder firmly, a gesture that seemed more restraining than reassuring. Richardson walked to the witness stand with measured steps. No dramatic flair, no emotional display, just the calm efficiency that had likely made her excellent at her former job. Ms. Richardson, the prosecutor began, can you tell us how you came to work for Mr. Combs? Richardson nodded, adjusting her glasses slightly. I was initially hired through a high-level staffing agency that specialized in executive support for entertainment industry figures. I had previously worked for a film producer and a record label executive. My references were strong, and I had a reputation for discretion and problem-solving. And what were your initial responsibilities? Standard executive assistant duties, she explained. Managing his calendar, coordinating travel, handling personal shopping, organizing his household, staff, fielding calls and emails. I worked primarily from his home office, though I traveled with him frequently. The prosecutor nodded. When did your role begin to change? Richardson's expression remained composed, but her hands clasped slightly tighter on the stand. There was an incident in late 2006 at Mr. Combs's Miami residence. A guest had become extremely intoxicated and was threatening to call tabloids about what she had witnessed at a private gathering the night before. I was asked to handle it. And how did you handle it? The prosecutor asked. I arranged for a private security team to escort her from the property. I negotiated a financial arrangement in exchange for her signature on a non-disclosure agreement. I personally took her phone and deleted photos and videos, and I created a cover story about her behavior in case she tried to speak out anyway. Evidence that she had been unstable, aggressive, making demands. Richardson paused. Mr. Combs was pleased with how I resolved the situation. He gave me a significant bonus, and from that point forward, my job description expanded considerably. The prosecutor approached with a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter this into evidence as Exhibit 72. It was a private employment agreement with unusual provisions about crisis management and reputation protection, along with substantial financial incentives tied to confidentiality. Maintenance. Richardson confirmed its authenticity. After this agreement, I became what you might call the fixer, Richardson explained. I was the person who made problems go away before they reached Mr. Combs's other legal teams or management. I was the first line of defense, particularly for situations that were too sensitive for normal channels. And what types of situations required this special handling? The prosecutor asked. Richardson looked directly at the jury. Situations that, if made public, would have destroyed the carefully constructed image Mr. Combs had built. Situations that, in some cases, I now understand, crossed legal and ethical boundaries that should never have been crossed. I've kept detailed records of everything, Richardson said, her voice calm but resolute. I've maintained this documentation not for revenge or financial gain, but because I gradually realized I was being made complicit in activities that troubled me deeply. She looked briefly toward Diddy. At first, I believed I was simply protecting a celebrity's privacy from intrusive media. That's what I told myself. But over time, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Richardson explained that her role evolved into managing what the team called the cleanup protocol, a systematic approach to containing potentially damaging situations. The protocol had specific steps, she detailed. First, secure the location. Retrieve all phones, cameras, any recording devices. Second, identify all witnesses and separate them. Third, implement individual containment strategies based on the person's status and relationship to Mr. Combs. The prosecutor displayed a document on the courtroom screen, a flowchart with decision trees. Richardson confirmed she had created it as a personal reference guide. For high-value contacts, we offered exclusive future opportunities, private investments, or special access to Mr. Combs's network. For industry professionals, we leveraged career advancement or threats of blacklisting. For ordinary civilians, we used financial settlements paired with extraordinarily restrictive NDAs. Richardson described how she personally maintained a database of these agreements, tracking payment schedules and compliance monitoring. I was instructed to flag anyone who might become a repeat concern, meaning someone who had witnessed something problematic more than once, or who seemed resistant to our containment efforts. The prosecutor displayed another document. And, what is this, Ms. Richardson? That's what we called the watch list. Individuals who had been flagged as potential liabilities and required ongoing monitoring or management. The list included names that sent murmurs through the courtroom. Some recognizable celebrities, music industry figures, and former employees. Richardson continued, explaining that the most disturbing aspect of her role emerged around 2010, when she began noticing a pattern at certain private gatherings. There were parties Mr. Combs hosted that had different security protocols than his public events. These were smaller, invitation-only gatherings at private residences. My responsibility was to ensure these events remained completely off the record. She described how guests at these exclusive gatherings would surrender their phones upon arrival, how certain rooms were designated as completely private, with no staff allowed, how she would be called, sometimes in the middle of the night, to arrange for medical professionals who would treat guests for various conditions, always doctors who had signed comprehensive confidentiality agreements. In 2012, there was an incident that particularly disturbed me, Richardson said, her composure finally showing small cracks. A young woman, an aspiring musician, needed medical attention after one of these gatherings. While waiting for the doctor to arrive, she told me she had been pressured to take substances she wasn't familiar with and couldn't remember much of the evening. Richardson paused. When I reported this to Mr. Combs, his concern wasn't for her well-being. He wanted to know if she'd signed the NDA before or after she'd been given the substances. When I told him it was before, he simply said, "Good." get her treatment, and get her out. The prosecutor approached with a medical invoice. "Is this the treatment you arranged?" Richardson identified the document, which had been carefully redacted, to protect the woman's identity while preserving the relevant details. "Yes, and you'll notice it's billed to one of the subsidiary companies we used specifically for handling sensitive expenses, companies whose financial records wouldn't directly connect to Mr. Combs in any public filing." "And what happened to Tui Tui, this woman afterward?" the prosecutor asked. "She was given a development deal that never materialized, relocated to another city, and placed on what we called the maintenance program, regular payments through a third-party entity in exchange for ongoing silence." Richardson took a moment to collect herself, then continued with renewed focus. The prosecutor guided her to elaborate on the systems she helped maintain throughout her employment. "It's important to understand that this wasn't just reactive damage. Control," she explained. "There was a proactive infrastructure designed to prevent information from ever becoming a problem in the first place." Richardson described how Diddy's properties were equipped with sophisticated surveillance systems, not just for security, but for monitoring guests and staff. How NDAs were required from everyone from caterers to maintenance workers. How employees were often housed in Diddy-owned properties where their activities could be monitored. "We maintained different tiers of NDAs," she continued. "Basic agreements for everyday staff, intermediate agreements for business associates, and what we called comprehensive containment agreements for anyone who had been present during potentially problematic situations." The prosecutor displayed several of these documents, with Richardson confirming their authenticity and explaining the increasingly restrictive provisions in each tier. The most concerning agreements included clauses that went beyond normal confidentiality, she noted. They included commitments to provide supportive statements if needed, to deny specific events even if directly questioned, and to alert Mr. Combs's team immediately if contacted by media or law enforcement. Richardson explained how these agreements were reinforced through both incentives and intimidation. Those who demonstrated absolute loyalty were rewarded generously: career opportunities, introductions to influential figures, invitations to exclusive events. But those who showed any hesitation faced immediate consequences. "What kind of consequences?" the prosecutor asked. "It started subtly: being excluded from important meetings, finding yourself assigned to less desirable projects. But it could escalate quickly. I personally witnessed promising careers suddenly stall after minor displays of independence. I saw business relationships terminated without explanation. The message was always clear: loyalty was the only currency that truly mattered." Richardson described how she maintained what was called the leverage file, documentation of potentially embarrassing or compromising information about individuals in Diddy's circle that could be used if necessary. I was instructed to update this file regularly, to note vulnerabilities that might be useful: financial difficulties, relationship problems, substance issues, career setbacks, anything that created pressure points that could be exploited if someone became uncooperative. Under fears, prosecutor presented a heavily redacted document that Richardson identified as a page from this file. Most of this information was never used overtly, she clarified. It didn't need to be. The implicit understanding that this leverage existed was usually sufficient to ensure compliance. Richardson explained that by 2013, she had begun to feel increasingly uncomfortable with her role. I started creating my own documentation, copies of communications, financial records, photographs. At first, I told myself it was professional diligence. But if I'm honest, I was building my own protection. I was realizing that I had become a participant in something deeply troubling, and I needed to preserve evidence of what I'd been directed to do. She described how her relationship with Diddy began to deteriorate as she became less willing to manage certain situations. When I started asking questions or suggesting more legitimate approaches to problems, I saw the same patterns of isolation and subtle intimidation that I had helped implement against others. I realized then that I was just another component in the system, useful until I wasn't, protected until I became a potential liability. The court took a brief recess, then reconvened with Richardson returning to the stand. Her demeanor remained professional, but there was visible relief in her expression now that the core of her testimony had been delivered. "Ms. Richardson," the prosecutor continued, "you worked for Mr. Combs for 10 years before leaving in 2014, what ultimately led to your departure." Richardson adjusted her glasses, her composure momentarily wavering. "There was a series of events in late 2013 that I found increasingly difficult to reconcile with my conscience. The final incident occurred at a private gathering at Mr. Combs's Hamptons residence in December of that year." She described arriving at the property the morning after the event to find the household in disarray, with security personnel acting with unusual urgency. "I was immediately directed to one of the guest suites where a young woman was in significant distress. She appeared disoriented and had visible bruising on her arms. When I asked what had happened, one of the security team told me, 'The usual, but worse. Handle it.'" Richardson explained that when she spoke privately with the woman, she learned she had been invited to meet with music producers, but instead found herself at a party where she was pressured to consume substances. She had fragmented memories of the night and was clearly traumatized. "What I did next violated our protocols," Richardson said firmly. "Instead of confiscating her phone and implementing our usual containment measures, I helped her contact a friend to pick her up. I gave her my personal contact information, and I told her that if she decided to report what happened, I would corroborate her account." The courtroom fell completely silent. When Mr. Combs learned what I had done, he was furious. Not because someone had been harmed under his roof, but because I had broken the system of protection we'd built around him. He reminded me of my contractual obligations, the consequences of breaching confidentiality, and how quickly he could ensure I never worked in the industry again. Richardson described the calculated decision she made in that moment. "I realized I had two choices: continue being part of the problem or find a way out that would protect both myself and potentially others in the future." Over the next few weeks, she explained, she methodically gathered and secured documentation while appearing to return to her compliant role. She carefully selected and encrypted the most significant evidence. She consulted privately with an attorney to understand her legal options and obligations. In February 2014, I submitted my resignation with the standard 2 weeks' notice. I cited family obligations and burnout as my reasons. I maintained a professional demeanor throughout the transition, trained my replacement, and fulfilled all expected duties. "Were there attempts to ensure your continued silence after your departure?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Richardson confirmed. "I was offered a substantial consulting contract that would have paid me for essentially doing nothing except remaining available and loyal. When I declined, the approach changed. I received what can only be described as a warning visit from someone connected to Mr. Combs's security team, reminding me of the mutual destruction that would result from any breach of confidentiality." Richardson maintained a low profile after leaving, moving to another state and shifting to an entirely different industry. "I effectively disappeared from the entertainment world. I believed that becoming invisible was my best protection." "What changed?" the prosecutor asked. "Why are you testifying today?" "The subpoena gave me a legitimate reason to break my silence," Richardson answered. "But more importantly, watching other victims come forward made me realize that my silence, however self-protective, was perpetuating harm. The patterns I helped maintain are still happening. The system is still functioning, and I can no longer justify my part in that, even through inaction. The prosecution concluded their direct examination, and Diddy's lead defense attorney approached for cross-examination. His demeanor was controlled but aggressive as he attempted to undermine Richardson's credibility and motivations. Ms. Richardson, you've presented yourself as someone who gradually developed moral concerns about your work, yet you remained employed for nearly a decade and accepted substantial compensation throughout that time. How do you reconcile that contradiction? Richardson met his gaze steadily. I don't claim moral perfection. I made compromises that I now regret. I prioritized professional success and financial security over ethical concerns for too long. I'm not presenting myself as a hero. I'm acknowledging my complicity while providing truthful testimony about what occurred. The attorney shifted tactics, questioning the reliability of her documentation. You've provided selected materials that support your narrative. But isn't it true that these represent a fraction of your overall work? Couldn't these incidents be taken out of context or misrepresented? The documentation I've provided includes full email chains, complete meeting notes, and unedited photographs specifically to prevent misinterpretation, Richardson responded. I've also supplied timestamps, attendee lists, and corroborating evidence precisely because I anticipated this concern. Context is included in the materials I've provided to the court. The defense attorney produced several performance reviews and bonus notifications from Richardson's employment file. These documents show you were repeatedly praised for your discretion and problem-solving. You accepted performance bonuses specifically tied to managing sensitive situations. Doesn't this suggest you were a willing and enthusiastic participant rather than a reluctant one? Richardson nodded slightly. Yes, I was good at my job. Yes, I was compensated well for it. And yes, for much of my employment, I rationalized my actions as normal industry practice. I'm not disputing that I participated. I'm testifying about what that participation entailed. The courtroom remained tense as the defense attorney continued his attempts to discredit her testimony, suggesting potential financial motivations for coming forward. Have you been approached about book deals, documentary appearances, or other opportunities that would profit from your alleged experiences with my client? I have declined all such offers, Richardson replied firmly. My attorney has records of these rejections. I have no financial interest in testifying. In fact, breaking my silence carries significant professional and personal risks. The defense strategy shifted again, this time suggesting that Richardson herself might face legal exposure for her actions. Aren't you concerned that your testimony today amounts to a confession of potentially illegal activities that you personally conducted? Or have you perhaps secured immunity in exchange for testifying against Mr. Combs? Richardson's response was measured but direct. I have not been granted immunity. I understand that my testimony may have consequences for me legally and professionally. I've accepted that possibility because continuing to protect this system of behavior is ultimately more damaging than whatever personal consequences I might face. The cross-examination continued for nearly 2 hours, with the defense attorney methodically challenging different aspects of Richardson's account. Throughout, she remained composed, clarifying when necessary, acknowledging limitations in her knowledge when appropriate, but never wavering on the core substance of her testimony. In a final attempt to undermine her credibility, the defense attorney displayed a series of cordial emails between Richardson and Diddy following her departure. Birthday, wishes, professional check-ins, seemingly friendly exchanges. These don't appear to be communications between someone who was allegedly traumatized by their employment and the person responsible. How do you explain maintaining such positive contact with Mr. Combs if your experience was as troubling as you claim? Richardson looked at the emails, then directly at Diddy for the first time since cross-examination began. Survival, she said simply. When you've spent years inside a system that punishes dissent and rewards compliance, those behaviors don't disappear overnight. Maintaining a facade of amicability was protection. Every woman in this courtroom understands the smile you put on when walking past someone who has power over you. She turned back to the defense attorney. Those emails are perhaps the most authentic evidence I've presented today. They demonstrate exactly how this system functions. Appearance versus reality. The public face versus the private truth. The defense had no further questions. When Amelia Richardson finally stepped down from the witness stand after nearly 6 hours of testimony, the courtroom remained unnaturally quiet. There was none of the usual shuffling of papers, whispered comments, or movement toward exits. The weight of what had been revealed seemed to hold everyone in place. Diddy sat motionless at the defense table, his expression unreadable, but his body language transformed from the confident posture he'd maintained. Throughout most of the trial, his shoulders were tense, his jaw rigid. His lead attorney was already scribbling urgent notes, presumably strategizing how to mitigate the damage in the days ahead. The prosecution had achieved something remarkable: testimony that connected. Disparate allegations into a coherent system, supported by documentation that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or revenge. Richardson hadn't just shared stories. She had provided the organizational blueprint that explained how problematic behaviors could continue for decades without consequences. Outside the courthouse, news of Richardson's testimony spread rapidly. Legal analysts appearing on live broadcasts described it as a potential turning point in the case. What we heard today wasn't just about individual incidents, one former prosecutor explained to cameras. It was about infrastructure, the deliberate creation of systems designed to enable certain behaviors while preventing accountability. Richardson herself left through a private exit, avoiding the media entirely. She had made no public statements beyond her sworn testimony and, according to court officials, had requested no special accommodations beyond basic security precautions. Their immediate impact rippled through multiple industries. Entertainment law firms began issuing guidance to clients about problematic NDA provisions. Talent agencies held emergency meetings about their duty of care to clients. Advocacy organizations reported spikes in calls from individuals previously hesitant to report similar experiences. Perhaps most significantly, other former employees from Diddy's organizations began coming forward. Not all with allegations of misconduct, but many confirming the operational details Richardson had described. The authentication of these procedural aspects lent additional credibility to her more serious claims. For Diddy, the strategic challenge was immense. Unlike allegations that could be framed as he said, she said disputes, Richardson's testimony was supported by documentation created during her employment, materials that had been part of doing her job effectively. Financial records, email chains, calendar entries, and photographs formed a contemporaneous record that was difficult to dismiss as fabrication. Legal experts noted that the case had evolved beyond the original charges. What we're potentially seeing now is evidence of a RICO case, one former federal prosecutor commented, referring to the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that addresses ongoing criminal enterprises. The systematic nature of what Richardson described, dedicated personnel, specialized financial channels, organized intimidation practices, these elements potentially transform individual incidents into something much more serious legally. As TC Day 12 of the trial concluded, The judge issued strict instructions against witness intimidation or harassment, specifically mentioning social media campaigns and third-party contacts. The unusual specificity of these warnings suggested the court's awareness of the potential for retaliation against those who had testified. The trial would continue, but something fundamental had shifted. Richardson's matter-of-fact testimony had removed the veil of celebrity mystique, revealing not just troubling behaviors, but the calculated infrastructure that had protected them for years. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for continuing coverage of this developing story. Hit that notification bell to make sure you don't miss any updates as this landmark case continues to unfold.